Hey there. Tonight, we're not just stepping into the past, we're stepping into its darkest chapter. Not war, not famine. Something worse, something quieter, something that came on the wind, slipped beneath doors, crept into beds and lungs and prayers. The plague. It didn't come with a warning. It came with rats, with breath, with the wrong kind of silence in a village that used to hum with life. And while history remembers kings fleeing in carriages, we're not following them. We're staying behind, with the peasants, the ones who couldn't run, the ones who survived or didn't by doing whatever it took, no matter how desperate, no matter how strange. Some of these tricks worked, some didn't, but they were all brutal, all real. If this kind of slow, immersive history helps you sleep, helps you think, helps you breathe just a little softer, feel free to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you think. And if you're still awake at the end, drop a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? Scattered souls drifting together into the same old story. So settle in, pull the blanket up, turn the lights low, because these aren't lessons from textbooks. They're the last-ditch methods of people who wanted nothing more than to see another sunrise. Let's begin. The cough starts in someone else's home. 3 huts down. A man, middle-aged, strong until last week. Now he won't stop shaking. Then the fever hits. Then the black spots bloom under the skin, like mold on old bread. And then silence. No one goes inside. The first trick to surviving the plague was simple. Forget what you loved and burn it. Clothes, blankets, tools, toys, dishes, bedding, gone. You didn't wait for a priest. You didn't look for heirlooms. You didn't whisper prayers over the embroidery your grandmother made. You piled it into a pit, doused it with oil or vinegar, or whatever passed for flammable, and set it alight. The smell was awful. Ash and wool and memory. You turned your face away, not from the heat, but from what it meant. Because you weren't burning things. You were burning reminders. A chair your husband sat in. A shawl your mother wore. A cradle that held a baby who didn't cry long enough. Gone. All of it. The fire didn't care about sentiment, and if you wanted to live, neither could you. Sometimes the bodies burned too, sometimes they were buried, but anything they touched, gone. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. If it smelled like sickness, it had to be erased. And so peasants, who owned almost nothing, gave up everything, willingly, out of fear, out of survival. Because superstition and instinct blended until even straw seemed dangerous. You learned to walk away from rooms you once cherished. You learned not to touch what once gave comfort. You learned that survival didn't just mean running from death. It meant setting fire to everything it brushed against, even if it had your name sewn into it. When the plague came close, close enough to hear coughing from the road, close enough to see a cart of bodies roll past, you didn't wait for orders. You disappeared. That was the second brutal trick. Remove yourself before the sickness gets the chance. And not politely, not with warning. You didn't pack a bag or kiss your neighbor goodbye. You vanished. You locked your door from the inside. You bolted shutters with rope and prayer. You made your home into a tomb and lived inside it like a ghost. No one visited. No one checked in. You became invisible. You kept the fire small, the light low. You cooked once a day, if that, and only things that smelled of nothing. Onion and root, boiled into bland paste. You didn't want to tempt the hungry. You didn't want the smell of life escaping your walls. You drank what you could store, rainwater, beer, wine gone sour. Anything safer than the well that might already be cursed. If someone knocked, you didn't answer. If someone cried for help, you didn't go. That hurt. It did. But mercy had a price now, and it was paid in breath. So you stayed hidden. For days. For weeks. If you had land, you let it go wild. No harvest was worth the plague, no market worth the contact. Better to starve slow and quiet than die quickly with lungs full of blood. You whispered instead of spoke, moved instead of walked. You taught your children to be small, to be silent, to be still, because still things were harder to notice, and unnoticed things lived longer. And when you finally stepped outside, if you did, it was like walking into a world that had forgotten your name. But at least you still had one, because the dead were remembered with pity. But the ones who vanished, they were envied. You can't see it, you can't fight it, but you know it's there. That was the fear, that was the logic. And so the third trick was born: change the air before it changes you. They called it bad air, miasma, the invisible fog that slipped into your nose, clung to your clothes, crept behind your ribs and settled there. It smelled wrong, sweet, rotting, sour, like fruit left in the sun. And if you could smell it, that meant it had already found you. So peasants lit fires, not for warmth but for defence. Wet herbs thrown onto coals, bundles of thyme, lavender, wormwood, anything strong, anything sharp. The smoke filled the house, stung the eyes, scratched the throat, but it was better than breathing in the plague. You hung bundles of dried plants over your door, crushed sage beneath your feet, lit fat-wrapped rags and waved them through every room. Smoke was the only armour you could afford. Some carried smouldering coals in pans, wafting smoke into corners, into rafters around beds. Others burned resin, if they could find it. Sticky pine sap melted into thick, choking clouds. There were even those who believed the stench of burning leather or dung would protect them. It wasn't about comfort, it was about control, because when the world feels cursed, you do anything to push back, and the scent of burning herbs gave you a weapon, one that didn't swing or cut or shout, just rose and lingered, and maybe, just maybe, kept death from crossing your threshold. So you coughed, you cried, you choked on the smoke you made, but you breathed it anyway, because breathing nothing was better than breathing plague. It doesn't sound like survival, it sounds like madness. But desperation twists logic, and during the plague, peasants learned the fourth brutal trick: hide behind stink. You don't clean, you don't sweep, you stop washing. Not because you're lazy, not because you've given up, but because filth, they said, keeps the plague away. Clean air was dangerous. Open windows were invitations. Breezes meant breath, and breath meant death. So you sealed it all. The shutters stayed shut, the smoke thickened. The floor became a mosaic of dried mud, crumbs, old rushes, and worse. You let the bedding sour, let the dishes crust, let the clothes stiffen with sweat. Some hung dead animals near doors, hoping their rot would trick the disease into turning away. Others smeared tar or thick black pitch across windowsills, around chimneys, in a sticky, clinging layer that looked like disease itself. You didn't bathe, you barely touched water, because rumour had it the plague could slip through the pores, ride on droplets, trickle down your spine like a curse. Instead, you rubbed your body with herbs or vinegar. You coated your hands with ashes or soot. Some wore old meat or poultices of onions and garlic, thinking the stink would drive off the invisible hand pressing down on their village. And strangely, the filth became comforting. It meant no one had died in your home. Yet, it meant you were still fighting. No one judged the smell. Everyone stank. Everyone looked half dead. That was the style now. The uniform of survival. You didn't fear looking ill. You feared looking inviting. So you built a wall out of rot, a shell of stink, a fortress of filth. And behind it, you waited, eyes open, breath shallow, hoping the plague would pass you by. It sounds cruel, cold, unforgivable, but it wasn't done out of callousness. It was done out of necessity. The fifth brutal trick: dig the hole before the dying starts. Because when death comes to a village, it doesn't knock politely. It floods the place. Fast. Without warning, without pause. And when that happens, the worst thing you can be is unprepared. So peasants dug graves. Early, wide, shallow if they had to. Not marked, not blessed, not beautiful, just ready. Some were for livestock, some were for strangers, some they knew would be for family. It didn't matter if it hadn't reached your street yet. It didn't matter if no one was coughing in your home. You dug anyway. Because once the dying started, there would be no time. You couldn't wait for the priest. He was probably already sick or gone. The grave diggers would be overwhelmed, or dead themselves. And when a body rots too long, it doesn't just offend, it infects. The smell spreads. The fear spreads faster. So you made the hole, covered it with planks. Or nothing. Maybe you placed a stone nearby, something to mark where not to walk, where to drop the body when the time came. If the time came. You hoped it wouldn't, of course you did, but hope didn't keep people breathing. Preparedness did. Some families had plans. If father died, mother would carry him with help from the eldest son. If the son died, the neighbour would be called, quietly, quickly before dawn. No wailing, no crowd, just two figures in the dark, doing what had to be done. One person digging a grave is mourning. 2, that's a mercy. 3, that's the beginning of an outbreak. So peasants did the unthinkable. They prepared for the worst, because the worst was already on its way. When the plague came close, close enough to steal sleep, close enough to turn the sky wrong, people didn't just run or pray. Some stopped eating. It sounds like madness, but it was the 6th brutal trick. Weaken the body before the plague can take hold. Why? Because hunger makes you slow, quiet, dull, and most importantly, still. Stillness was safety. Fewer trips to the well, fewer visits to the neighbour's fence, fewer chances to breathe someone else's sickness. When you eat less, you move less, and when you move less, you survive longer. Some believed the plague grew faster in a hot body, one full of food, energy, movement, so they emptied themselves out, on purpose. A fast wasn't a holy ritual anymore, it was a shield. You ate bread, and only if it was hard. You drank water, and only if it was clean. Some went full days with nothing but a clove of garlic, or a spoon of vinegar mixed into sour ale. Not to strengthen the body, but to keep it low, empty, unwelcoming. Children were kept lean, no milk unless the cow still lived. No meat, never meat. That was for the rich, and even they weren't safe, because the sicker you looked, the less anyone came near you. And that, ironically, helped you live. Some even rubbed ash on their faces, hollowed their cheeks, told rumours that their home had already been visited, just to keep others away. It wasn't cruelty, it was defence, and if you were hungry, if your stomach growled through the night, if your hands trembled by noon, it meant you were still alive. Alive enough to go one more day without food, alive enough to keep death confused, alive enough to be ignored by the very thing killing everyone else. You didn't grow strong to survive the plague. You got small and disappeared beneath it. Chapter 7, Let the Healthy Die Alone. You see him in the morning, young, strong, red in the face from carrying wood just yesterday. Now he's coughing. That's how it always starts. A little cough, a little heat behind the eyes. Then the voice goes hoarse. Then the black swelling begins. And that's when you make the decision. You don't say goodbye. You don't bring water. You don't step inside. The 7th brutal trick. Abandon the living before they look dead. It wasn't malice, it was math. 1 person dead is grief. 2 is a risk. 3 is a funeral you won't survive. So when someone showed the signs, you backed away. Slowly, carefully, Maybe you left a bowl of broth near the door. Maybe you whispered a prayer, but you didn't touch them, you didn't cross the threshold, you didn't kiss the forehead, even if it was your child, especially if it was your child, because love didn't save anyone from the plague. And compassion was often a death sentence. Entire families turned their backs on each other, not because they stopped caring, but because they wanted someone, anyone, to still be standing when it ended. A healthy man was the most dangerous of all. He could carry the sickness without showing it, spread it before the boils bloomed, smile in the morning, dead by night, and leave 5 more coughing behind him. So even the well were suspect, and the sick, they were already gone. Some begged at the door, others just fell silent. You didn't ask which was worse, you just learned not to listen. Because if you answered the knock, you let death in, and if you sat beside the bed, you didn't rise from it. So you left them, not out of hate, not out of cruelty, but because you had one job left: live. Sometimes the sick got desperate. They would rise in the night, confused by fever, skin like ash, breath like fire, and stumble from their huts, calling for help, searching for water, or worse, trying to come inside. So peasants learned a trick no one ever wanted to speak of. Use the bodies to bar the door. It wasn't common, but it happened. When a family had already fallen, when there was no one left to bury them, when the hut sat silent but not empty, the village made a decision. Quiet, quick, agreed upon with no words spoken aloud. They dragged the corpses into place, one across the inside of the doorway, one pressed against the shutters. Sometimes, if a child had died first, their body was laid beneath the threshold, as if to keep the sickness from crawling out. And then the house was sealed, not boarded, not blessed, just left. Sometimes marked with ash, sometimes with a rope tied across the entry, or a single cross carved into the doorframe, not to honour, but to warn. You didn't speak of what was inside, and if a voice called out later, thin, weak, pleading, you didn't answer, because no one inside could be saved, and no one outside was willing to join them. It was grim, it was grotesque, but it was a message. One death could save a dozen. One door properly shut could hold the line. And the worst part, you hoped if your time came, they'd do the same for you, to keep the village safe, to keep the others breathing, to make your final moments mean something more than just end. You became the lock, so no one else had to. By now you know the rules of survival. Don't look healthy, don't smell clean, don't draw attention. But peasants learned to take it one step further. The 9th brutal trick: look sick, on purpose. If the plague passed through your village and you didn't show signs, that made you suspicious. If soldiers came to quarantine the town, or if neighbouring villagers blocked trade, you needed to look like everyone else, or risk being blamed, accused, banished, burned. So you dressed for the part, you smeared your cheeks with ashes, rubbed dirt into your fingernails, hollowed your eyes with soot. Some even painted false sores onto their skin, little blotches of crushed berries or old ink, meant to mimic the bruised swellings everyone feared. It was theatre, grim theatre, but it kept you safe. No one dragged you from your home. No one forced you into the fields to bury others. No one knocked, asking for favours or food or help, because you looked like you were already halfway dead. And that bought you time. Even children were taught to perform it. Limp a little, cough softly. Don't make too much noise, just enough. A visible sign of weakness was better than being seen as a threat, because healthy meant useful, and useful meant expendable. No one conscripted the dying. No one sent them on errands. No one asked them to clean the bodies. So you lowered your voice, moved slower, avoided eye contact, and waited. Waited for the plague to pass you by, to forget your name, to see your face and keep walking. You didn't just survive the sickness, you pretended to have it, just to avoid what came with staying well. When the world started to die, people ran in all directions. Some ran into the forest, some into the hills, and some into the arms of God. That was the 10th brutal trick. Make yourself invisible inside the sacred. The plague didn't fear churches, but people did. Priests, monks, and peasants alike began to believe that holy places could act as shelter, not from man, not from law, but from death itself. So peasants sought out shrines, chapels, small roadside crosses weathered by rain and lichen. They slept near them, ate beside them, hid behind their carved stone faces and whispered, "Not me, please, not me." Some moved into churchyards, lay down among the graves, not because it was safe, but because it was believed that death wouldn't take what it had already touched. Others bribed priests for a corner of the nave or a spot near the altar. Families curled beneath pews, breathing incense and damp rot, thinking the plague wouldn't dare follow them there. And when the churches filled with bodies, they found new places, blessed springs, forgotten hermit caves. Anything that bore a whisper of sacredness. It wasn't comfort, it wasn't even hope, it was camouflage. You made yourself part of the prayer, part of the ritual, part of the wood and stone and incense smoke. And with every hour you lived, you believed the place was holding you up, even if the priest was dead, even if the icons had fallen, even if no one was left to say your name aloud. You stayed anyway, because the plague might not care what was holy. But you did, and sometimes belief was the only thing stronger than fear. Silver meant nothing now. The markets were closed, the merchants were dead. No one wanted your coin. They wanted onions, herbs, smoke, charcoal, vinegar, anything that might keep the coughing away. So peasants turned to the 11th brutal trick. Share knowledge, not wealth. Because when the doctors were gone, when the apothecaries boarded their doors, when the priests were burying more than they could count, only the whispers remained. A root boiled in ale, a crushed leaf rubbed under the arms, a charm buried in the garden. These were the new currency, and you didn't sell it, you traded it. A neighbour comes in the dusk with nothing but a bundle of garlic tied with rough twine. She doesn't ask for bread, she asks what you burned when your cousin survived. You tell her, lavender and sage boiled in vinegar. Thick cloth over the face, no visitors, no light for 3 days. She nods. She gives you the garlic anyway. You take it, not because you need it, but because the exchange matters. It means you're still connected, still human. In a world falling apart, every scrap of wisdom becomes gold, and gold becomes irrelevant. Old women became oracles. The ones who used to mumble to themselves while gathering weeds were now sought out, because they remembered what root soothed the chest, which flower held off fever, which mushrooms to dry and grind and bury beneath the floor. You learn to listen to the quiet people, because loud people got sick fast, and sometimes you didn't even want the cure. You just wanted to hear something that worked, something that helped, even once. You memorized it, passed it on, changed it slightly, made it yours. That's how peasants survived. Not with medicine, but with memory, passed from mouth to mouth like prayer. It wasn't enough to burn herbs at home, or to fill the air with bitter smoke. If you wanted to move, to walk through the village, to fetch water, to pass by the homes of the dying, you needed more than luck. You needed flame. The 12th brutal trick. Carry fire with you, everywhere. It wasn't symbolic, it was survival. You lit a bundle of herbs and carried it like a torch, not to see, but to purify. The fire burned low, thick with scent, sage, rosemary, mugwort, maybe dried dung if that's all you had. The smoke curled around your body, clung to your clothes, masked your breath. Some wore it around their neck, Tiny clay pots of embers hung by twine. Others held smoking sticks close to their mouths, breathing through the smoke itself like a veil. Because the fear wasn't just of others, it was of the air. Every step outside was a gamble. You didn't know who had coughed there or died there, or what wind had carried death around the corner. So you brought your own shield. Not metal, not wood, but heat. If you passed someone in the road, you didn't speak. You raised your smoking bundle higher, as if to say, I am guarded, I am burning, stay away. Even children learned to carry it. Clumsy fists wrapped in cloth, holding twigs like candles. The brave ones volunteered to run errands, so long as the smoke stayed thick and the path stayed short. It wasn't safe. Embers fell, hands burned, ashes smeared onto skin and clothes and eyes. But it was worth it, because the only thing worse than the sickness was being unprepared for it. And if fire was the last barrier between you and the plague, you held it tight and let the world see your fear, wrapped in flame. There came a point where nothing was safe. Not the food, not the fields, not even the act of eating itself. So peasants turned to the 13th brutal trick. Eat what others wouldn't touch. The plague didn't just kill people, it broke supply lines. Markets vanished, fields rotted. Bakers stopped baking, brewers stopped brewing, and animals, those that weren't already dead, became too valuable to slaughter. So the peasants changed their diet. They boiled weeds, nettles, bitter greens that once fed pigs. They dug up roots so stringy and sour they'd never been touched in better years. Moss scraped from stones, tree bark peeled and softened in lye. Bread made of crushed acorns soaked and ground into something chewable. Not delicious, not even safe, just possible. The trick wasn't just about desperation, it was survival through indifference. If a rat wouldn't eat it, maybe the sickness wouldn't like it either. If the meat smelled off, but not spoiled, you scraped the mould and cooked it longer. You added ash to your soup, mud to your flour. You thickened broths with bones so old they crumbled in the pot. You didn't share recipes. You guarded them, because knowing how to make something from nothing wasn't a skill anymore. It was a lifeline. And if the village heard you were still eating, someone might come asking, or take what you had. So you ate in silence. You chewed slow. You learned to swallow without flinching. And maybe your stomach turned. Maybe your tongue went numb, but you were still upright, still breathing, because in times like these, food wasn't comfort, it was defiance, a mouthful of grit, a spoonful of bitter, and one more day alive. There were no suitcases, no wagons for the poor, no packed meals waiting in baskets when the time came to run. So peasants learned one final rule, one brutal simplification. Own nothing that can't be carried, because when the plague came, it didn't knock. It didn't wait for you to gather your things. It arrived like smoke, quiet, sudden, and permanent. The smart ones knew better than to cling to anything heavy. Your best pot? Leave it. Your chair, your chest, your family loom. All too slow, all too large, all reminders of a life that couldn't outrun death. Instead, you boiled life down to what fit in your hands. A pouch of salt, a knife, a strip of dried onion, a small crucifix wrapped in cloth. If it couldn't go around your neck, into your pocket or under your shirt, it stayed behind. Even sentiment was a luxury. You didn't cry over heirlooms. You didn't pause for keepsakes. You knew the cost of hesitation. You watched as others tried to bring a bundle too big, to drag a box down a muddy path. They made it 2 miles, 1, sometimes less, until they had to choose the load or their life. You chose your life. Some tied everything in cloth and slung it over a stick. Some wore layers, 3 tunics, 2 cloaks, everything they owned now part of their skin. Others brought nothing, trusted the road, trusted chance, and when you passed an abandoned village, You saw what was left behind. Pots still on fires. Toys dropped mid-play. A doll with its face half sewn. A book with pages fluttering in wind that no one would ever turn again. It hurt, but you kept walking, because in plague time you weren't measured by what you carried. You were measured by what you didn't. When you approached a village, whether you were fleeing the plague or hoping to return, you didn't shout. You didn't knock. You didn't wave. You raised a tool. That was the 15th brutal trick. Let what you carried speak before your mouth ever did. If you had a shovel, you showed it. If you had a scythe, you leaned it against the fence post. If you had a broom, you laid it across your lap where it could be seen. Not to threaten, not to posture, to offer. Because plague made every stranger a danger. But it also made every pair of hands a chance to survive. And the difference between the two came down to how you arrived. So peasants learned, fast, that your body told one story, but your tools told another. If you came carrying something useful, you weren't a burden. You were help. You could bury. You could scrub. You could build. And maybe, just maybe, you'd be allowed to stay. But if you came empty-handed, or with a weapon instead, the door didn't open. Or worse, it opened with a bow drawn behind it. There were no second chances in plague time, so men wore their hammers like badges. Women tied bundles of herbs where they'd be seen. Children dragged brooms taller than themselves, dragging dust to prove they knew how to clean. You didn't speak first, you showed your worth first. It was barter, without words, negotiation without promises. You needed shelter, they needed labor. And in between those needs there was only one question. What did your hands know? If you had no answer, you moved on. Quiet, quickly. Grateful to still have a place to walk away to, because during the plague, even the tools had voices, and they could save your life before you even said a word. By the end, even the houses weren't safe. The windows breathed death. The walls sweated with it. The air inside had gone still, thick, heavy with everything that had already happened. So the 16th brutal trick was simple, but terrifying. Sleep outside, far from the walls. It wasn't a choice of comfort, it was a choice of survival. When someone in the house began to cough, you didn't wait to see who next. You didn't count days or symptoms. You opened the door and left. You slept beneath trees, in the garden, against the cold stone of the church wall, anywhere the wind could still touch your face. Not because it was warm, it wasn't, but because the wind moved. And moving air, they said, couldn't carry sickness the same way. It blew the death away. It cleared the lungs. It kept your breath from looping back in on itself. You wrapped yourself in whatever you had, an old cloak, a sack, a bundle of straw, and lay down under stars that barely remembered your name. Some dug shallow pits just to get lower than the frost. Some slept standing, leaning against a tree or fence, too afraid to rest too deep. Others stayed up all night, dozing in shifts, watching the house like it might attack. It wasn't just about leaving the sick behind. It was about leaving the air they touched, and in the night you heard things, whispers, moans, the long breathless silence that followed a final cough. But you didn't go back in, not even when it was your brother, not even when it was your child, because love couldn't survive where breath had gone thick. Only distance could, so you lay under sky, cold and alone, but still breathing, still waiting, because there would be no comfort now, only the hope that come morning, you'd still be here to see it. There are too many to mourn, too many to mark, too many to bury deep or properly or at all. And so the last brutal trick, the quietest, the hardest, the one no one admits to, is this. You forget their names. Not because you want to, because you have to. because remembering all of them would tear your mind in half, because every name is a thread, and if you follow them all, you unravel. So you learn to let go, not of love, but of recall. You stop saying the names out loud, you stop counting the graves, you stop pointing at the empty beds, the quiet chairs, the unfinished shirts still hanging on the line. You stop whispering stories about who they were, what they laughed at, how they cried when they were little, because each memory is a weight, and you are already carrying too many. Some carve a mark into wood, some leave a rock at the door, some plant nothing because nothing will grow, and others simply walk away. You build new lives with fewer words, fewer connections, fewer risks. You learn to nod instead of greet, to wave instead of speak, because the fewer ties you make, the fewer you'll have to cut. And in time the names fade, first the distant ones, then the closer, and finally the ones you swore you'd never forget. You live, that's all. You keep your head down, keep your breath shallow, keep walking, because survival in the end is not about remembering, it's about enduring what remembering would do to you. And so you forget, and you live. That's the end. 17 brutal tricks, 17 ways to stay one step ahead of the darkest thing peasants ever faced. No science, no medicine, just instinct, desperation, silence. Some of these worked, some didn't, but all of them were real. This was survival with no safety net, no headlines, no history books written in your name. Just days counted in shallow breaths and nights spent trying not to cough. And yet, some made it, somehow. Through ash, through hunger, through loss too heavy to carry, but carried anyway. If this helped you unwind, helped you drift, helped you feel something small and human in the stillness, feel free to like and subscribe. It really does help more than you think. And if you're still awake, leave a comment below. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's oddly comforting to see a thread of quiet listeners stretch across the world like that. Same story, different rooms. Now the fire's low, the wind is still, and if you've made it this far, you've survived something too. Sleep well.